Hi, my name is Chris, lead quantum analyst at The Resonance, or as you may know, the Quantum Insider. And today I'm going to be speaking about your quantum playbook, turning insight into action. So at a very high level, what am I going to be speaking about? I'm going to be doing a little bit of a reality check. Take a look at what we're seeing in terms of the news, the press releases coming out from the industry, try to get a sense on what's happening in terms of positioning, communication around tech advancements. Focus on a couple of key quantum milestones. Obviously, talk a bit about the roadmaps and where we see the technology going, what is real, what is just hype. Quantum playbook, what action looks like today and what some of those opportunities could be. I'm not going to dig too much into the detailed summary of that, but at a very high level, the talk today is specifically around key signals we're seeing in the market, strategic implications for enterprise leaders, as well as organizational readiness. So, the reality check. What Resonance is seeing. Let's start out with the quantum market. At a very high level, quantum market is maturing. As of May this year, we have already seen about 70% of last year's total funding has been reached. This is pretty significant when you consider that only about 25% of these deals have been completed. Other interesting trends that we're noticing: fewer rounds, bigger bets, higher risk. Investors seem to be concentrating capital more on later stage commercialization ready companies, less so on the small emergent kind of startups. We're also seeing that the majority of investments have been in quantum computing as opposed to the other quantum technology verticals. This accounts for about 64% of the total deals that we've been tracking, the whole of 24 and what we've seen in 2025 this year as well. It's really interesting looking at the QPU sales. So this is a metric that we've been tracking for quite some time now as well. Last year, we were able to track $854 million in terms of QPU sales. This is pretty interesting as it's up about 70% from the year before, 2023. Taking a look at last year, we saw about 41 of these QPU sales or deals going down. This is up from just 19 in 2021. Other interesting aspects of this is average deal size has been coming down. So we're seeing more sales, more units, wider adoption at reduced prices. We've also seen what these deals and partnerships look like, and customers are moving more towards multi-year contracts and full stack system bundles over once-off on-premise kind of installations. So some insight from the buyer side. What we do know, or what we've been able to identify, is that at least 55% of all of these commercial orders since 2012 have happened just within the past 2 years. So ramping up adoption, exploration, and the demand for these systems. There's a growing demand for starter systems, and this is specifically a trend we're seeing in emergent countries, emergent markets. This makes sense. They're a little bit late to the race, so how do they accelerate their journey? How do they fast-track their regional or local initiatives? Go for a starter system. We've also seen that there's quite a large diversification in the demand for types of quantum computers. While 60% of the order value that we've tracked is concentrated around superconductivity, in terms of the order volume, over 40% of this is diversified into the other modalities such as trapped ion systems, neutral atoms, photonics, and even NV centers. So there is a demand to diversify and de-risk through looking at different types of technologies. Tracking what's happening in the quantum market is pretty interesting. There's some key insights that we've been able to identify there as well. Investors are betting on commercialization, not just potential. So again, this emphasis on later, more technology-ready kind of investments. Enterprise buyers are shifting from pilot to procurement. Vendors are positioning themselves as full-stack providers, so not just the hardware, the entire solution range all the way into realizing the applications and the solutions around that. quantum stock performance has been pretty interesting, and as of last week at least, we see that a number of the publicly traded companies are actually outperforming traditional stocks. Of course, there's a lot of volatility in this, but it's interesting to take note of. So, it is the year of quantum, and what a time to be alive. This year, specifically the last couple of months, has seen a proliferation and abundance of really high-profile, high-stakes publications, press releases coming out. And things are just accelerating. This ranges in everything from new hardwares, new platforms being released, being developed, massive strides that we're seeing with the quantum information side. For example, this factorization paper from Google just a couple of weeks ago. Some of the advancements on the hardware side are a bit controversial, but as I said, things are ramping up. And just last week alone, we saw at least 3 massive press releases coming out for some really large players in the space. For example, IonQ hosted a webinar where they updated their most recent roadmap and outlined how they're going to be targeting 80,000 logical qubits by 2030. It's pretty significant. That was closely followed by IBM, who also presented an updated roadmap. And this is one of the most detailed roadmaps so far from IBM on how they're going to be approaching 2,000 logical qubits by 2033, and a lot of information on the substack that's going into building their Blue Jay and Sterling architectures. Obviously, there's not enough time to go through all of the different press releases and the really important ones, so I'm going to focus on just a couple of the ones that I feel are particularly significant in trying to understand what is happening in the quantum world and trying to get a feeling of the pulse of this right now. So let's look at some of the key quantum milestones. Okay, great. So, not technically in the year of quantum, Google announced their 105 superconducting processor last December. The reason why I've included this, however, is it was at that time, after this announcement, that we really started seeing explosion on the quantum stock market. So this was really good for the companies and the ecosystem in general. So it's nice to call out. One of the reasons why I'm bringing this up is this is a really interesting press release or announcement for a couple of reasons for me. First off, obviously on the technology side, this is Google's most advanced QPU yet. They have made some serious advancements when it comes to reducing error rates as well as scaling up their system. So it's the largest processor that they actually have. More importantly, however, a lot of the communication around this technology was focused on the fact that this is their first processor that has been designed and fabricated and developed with quantum error correction in mind. So this is a clear indication that quantum error correction is being implemented into the production of these systems already, which is really nice to see, and it speaks to their strategy around scaling these systems. Secondly, what was particularly interesting about this press release is that Google mentioned the only reason they were able to develop this very sophisticated system was thanks to their investment in their own in-house superconducting specific fabrication facility. So this is a very important theme. How do you access these facilities? And it just goes to show even these very large players sometimes have to think about these very intricate infrastructures and how to access them. AWS also announced their first quantum computing chip. This is the Oscillate. So what's really interesting about this is 2 things that I'd like to mention. First off, just as with Google, this chip is specifically being designed and developed with quantum error correction in mind. It's a very different approach to what the other QPU providers are taking. However, again, this goes to testament or testifying to the fact that error correction is now something that is being adapted into the technology as it is being developed. It's no longer some sort of separate silo, which I think is really interesting for this new wave of technology. Secondly, I consider this a really good return on investment that they've made at their quantum center, which is in collaboration with Caltech. So again, what's really interesting about this is they were able to develop this technology and continue to develop the technology thanks to investments in regional, strategic regions that have research excellence and facilities in certain regions. So I think that's a really important point from that release. Okay, moving a little bit away from the hardware and onto the quantum algorithms or quantum compute aspect, D-Wave had a really interesting article that was released, or published rather, earlier this year. Now, this specific paper is interesting to me for two reasons. First off, it is a very good example of how to manage a very complex collaboration that involved several universities within Canada, most notably Quantum Matter Institute at University of British Columbia, as well as SFU, as well as University of Toronto. It also involved some national facilities within the US and researchers all the way as far as Switzerland. So this goes into testament not only how good they are at developing technologies, the research aspect, but also coordination around rolling out these research projects and application exploration. Secondly, what makes this really interesting is this specific paper addresses the concept of quantum advantage. Now, this is extremely interesting to think about, and whenever these type of papers come out, there's a lot of discussion within the community. What do you mean by advantage? What do you mean by supremacy? And then there's going to be a lot of back and forth between can a classical system actually do this or not? So it's fantastic to actually see the rhetoric around these kind of publications. To put this into perspective, I think it's really interesting to take a look back at the last couple of years. The first paper on quantum supremacy came out in 2019. This was by Google when, well, John Martinez was still part of that team. That was the famous milestone paper. We then had another really interesting paper from Xanadu based on their sophisticated photonic chip, the Borealis, which claimed quantum primacy. And now we've got this one from D-Wave. So at least two of the last three significant publications looking at this concept of supremacy, advantage, primacy from Canadian researchers, which I think is testament to the ambitiousness of our community, which is really nice to see. Okay, probably one of the most controversial of all of the press releases this year. Microsoft joins the race with its Majorana chip. There's a lot to unpack here, and developing a Majorana technology seems to be extremely complicated, very difficult thing to do. There's a lot of engineering issues or challenges with this. On top of that, there are significant questions around the underlying fundamental physics that's being incorporated into this device. So it's a really tough challenge. They knew this would be controversial. So the question is, why put out this paper? Like, why make this claim? And to me, this is a really interesting question to ask. And I think what this comes down to, or the way that I at least look at this, is if you are a hyperscale compute company, it is now seen as more risky not to try and show leadership than what it is to put out a hype piece. So I think that's telling you something about how these very large companies are thinking about their position and how they are trying to pivot themselves in the space. NVIDIA. This specific slide is speaking about their investment in a quantum research center. So this is in Boston, Massachusetts. Another really good example of a big corporation putting a lot of investment or backing a regional ecosystem because of the national strengths that they have there, and figuring out how to leverage that. But I think there's a much more interesting, larger overarching theme with how NVIDIA is interacting with quantum. If we backtrack all the way to January, February, the CES comment when the CEO said that useful quantum applications are 15 to 20 years off. 2 months later, a month later, they announced that they are investing in the Quantum Research Center. Fast forward all the way to last week, and the CEO says that quantum has already reached an inflection point. So taking a step back and actually looking at the narrative here, I think is really interesting. And to me, it's all about positioning. How do you actually showcase leadership in this field? And I think that there's a very big power play here to try to define what leadership is, positioning yourself, and also controlling the narrative around quantum technology. So I think this is a very key takeaway that I'm seeing. And I think that this is a masterclass in terms of pivoting yourself in this kind of emergent, rapidly evolving field. So what are some of the strategic signals that we see behind these headlines? So quantum is becoming the next layer of infrastructure. There's been a significant shift from fringe to foundation. So it's no longer considered experimental. We're seeing a lot more appetite for the adoption, the exploration, whatever that may look like or be. We know that these systems are now being embedded in cloud workflows. It's no longer an isolated or a silo activity. It's a lot more integrated into different types of corporations and enterprises. And we've moved from exploration to execution. And what we see is a lot of evolution from the investment landscape. So, roadmaps. Where is the technology going? Bear with me. There's a lot happening on the slide. And a lot of people get irritated by this because they say the qubit number is not the be-all and end-all of quantum. Completely agree with you. However, it is one of the metrics that we know the most about, and it's one that is featured in almost all of the company roadmaps. So what is important for us to look at on the left, we see physical qubits, so how many qubits are being developed, and this is a timeline. So the important things here, exponential increase in scale. So these systems are becoming bigger, more powerful all the time, which is really nice to see. Then on top of that, what I find really interesting, over the last 1 or 2 years, there's definitely been a shift in the way that we're talking about these roadmaps. And that's this second y-axis, this logical qubits. People are now speaking about error-corrected systems. So we've been able to track through the roadmaps what fully error-corrected logical qubit counts we're going to have within the near future. And I think this discussion around NISQ error versus fault tolerance and this weird gray area that we're in between now where people are starting to see the first stages of error-corrected systems start coming online is really interesting. So we need to have a new discussion around what does this phase, gray area in between fault tolerance and pure NISQ actually look like. So it's really nice to see people speaking about logical qubits. It's been a big shift in the market. Another really technical slide, sorry about that. It's not just about the qubits, not just about the number of qubits, it's also about the quality. How noisy are they? What are these error rates? So essentially what you want to see is lots of qubits and smaller error rates. So in other words, going in this direction. Now, at the stage of millions of qubits with very low error rates, we've got fault tolerance. And the color coding that you're seeing at the back there is actually trying to highlight how we start thinking about this transition from the noisy NISQ error system to something a little bit better for utility. The reason why it's wedged like this is this bottom step, everything below that we can actually quite easily simulate using conventional semiconductor technology. It's only when you start approaching 100 qubits that you can't simulate them anymore at very low error rates. So what's particularly interesting with the current state of technology, you'll see that there's a couple of data points at this wedge. And this boundary is not very fixed. It's blurry. It depends on the types of technologies, whether you're implementing error correction, whether you're doing noise mitigation. So that can shift. And what this means is we've actually now moved into an era where the systems are powerful enough for us to start dabbling in applications. It might not be the largest application. It might not be industry ready, but it at least gives us something to play around with. So Quantum Playbook, what action looks like today? Obviously, as these systems continue to scale, there's going to be a lot of new opportunities that get unlocked. Where do we see these opportunities? Specialized component supply chain. Obviously, there's a need for components. These are very specialized. The QPU providers don't always need to have control over all of that. So startups and spin-outs can help fill this gap. Accelerated M&A activity. Prototyping, testing infrastructure, standardization, and strategic leveraging. Expansion of high-value use cases. We've heard a lot about this over the course of the last few days. Of course, with all of these new opportunities, there are a lot of challenges as well. Expertise gap. We've heard a lot about this over the last few days. Yesterday, there was a very interesting data point given. There are only 4,000 quantum engineers in the whole world. I mean, that's keeping up the entire ecosystem. That's crazy. Lack of internal buy-in. We always hear about the dangers of hype. I would say that we're in a phase now where pessimism is a lot more dangerous than what overhyping something is. Fragmented ecosystem and regional disconnects, this is probably one of the most frustrating issues or barriers to deal with. This is just because you need to rely on partners. You need to be having an ecosystem. You need people involved in your technology and to speak to. So obviously engagement, there's an entire spectrum, and it depends, it differs depending on every single enterprise. You might just be interested in observing, exploring, all the way through to implementing or actually heavily investing in quantum and making it a core aspect or value proposition for your company. So, turning awareness into action. How to begin building your organization's quantum readiness. This starts with internal discussion. It's about leadership, it's about ownership. You need to have a vision, you need to have a mandate, and that needs to be clear. Second, you need action. Where do you start implementing this? Now again, this is different depending on the enterprise. It could be a quantum testbed, it could be a use case exploration. Maybe this just is about education and workforce development. You need to start somewhere. And thirdly, building partnerships. I can't stress enough how important your regional ecosystem is. So you need to be speaking to people within that ecosystem. And if you don't have an ecosystem, what are you doing to build that ecosystem? So I'd like to close off just with a note that echoes the overarching theme of this conference. Quantum might be the future, but it's also happening right now, and it's time for you to act. Thank you.